echoes of empire, from the colonial appropriation of Kemet to federal intervention in Washington, D.C. Introduction. This report argues that the recent federal intervention in the governance of Washington, D.C., while framed as a response to a domestic crisis, is a modern manifestation of colonial power dynamics that have deep historical roots. By examining the methods of control, appropriation, and subjugation pioneered during the European colonization of Kemet, ancient Egypt, a consistent ideological framework emerges, one that continues to inform the exertion of centralized authority over historically marginalized populations. This analysis will connect the looting of Kemetic wisdom and the suppression of its people to the modern-day erosion of local autonomy in America's capital. The through line is a persistent logic of empire, which first defines a targeted population as incapable of self-governance and then uses that pretext to justify intervention, seize control of local institutions, and impose an external will. This investigation reveals a continuum of systemic oppression, demonstrating that the political struggles in contemporary Washington, D.C. are not isolated events, but are in fact echoes of an imperial history that began centuries ago on the banks of the Nile. Section 19, the colonization of Kemet, a legacy of power, plunder, and epistemic violence. The foundation of this analysis rests on the premise that modern European colonialism in Egypt was not merely a military or economic project, but a profound act of cultural and intellectual appropriation. This process systematically stripped Kemet of its history, reframed its legacy to serve imperial interests, and established a paradigm of domination that would be replicated for centuries. The creation of the academic field of Egyptology, the physical plunder of a regal heritage, and the economic restructuring of the nation were not separate endeavors, but interlocking components of a singular colonial machine designed to subjugate a people by first conquering their past. The imperial genesis of Egyptology. The modern European-dominated field of Egyptology did not arise from a neutral scholarly curiosity. It was born from an act of imperial aggression. Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1798 served as the catalyst for this new discipline. The French expedition was a dual conquest. In addition to 54,000 soldiers and 400 ships, Napoleon brought 150 savants, scientists, engineers, and scholars whose mission was not to capture Egyptian soil, but to capture Egyptian culture and history. This marked the beginning of a process where Kemet's past was appropriated by Europeans for Europeans. While Arabic scholars had long engaged with the ancient remains, their work was systematically marginalized and supplanted by this new Western-led academic enterprise. This dynamic is best understood through the Foucauldian concept of power knowledge, which posits that knowledge is not an abstract truth, but a form of power used to control and manipulate populations. The French Commission des Sciences et Arts d'Egypte meticulously measured, mapped, and drew the temples, tombs, and artifacts of pharaonic Egypt, publishing their findings in the monumental Description de l'Egypte beginning in 1809. This act of systematic study and classification was not a benign cataloging. It was a mechanism of control. By defining, categorizing, and interpreting Kemet, Europe established itself as the sole authority on its history, effectively seizing intellectual ownership of the civilization. This knowledge control became a cornerstone of Western policy in the Middle East, a way to establish superiority and justify colonial rule without the constant need for direct military occupation. The very structure of the discipline reinforced this Western domination. The primary academic languages of Egyptology became English, French, and German, reflecting the imperial power relations of the era and marginalizing all other languages, including Arabic. Egyptian scholars found themselves in the paradoxical position of having to master European languages to become experts in their own country's heritage. Appropriation of a regal heritage. The intellectual conquest of Kemet was accompanied by a physical one. The French invasion ignited a phenomenon in Europe known as Egyptomania, a fervent interest in Egyptian culture that fueled the systematic looting of its artifacts. The Rosetta Stone, the key to deciphering ancient hieroglyphs, serves as a potent symbol of this dynamic. Discovered by the French, it was subsequently seized by the British as a spoil of war following the Battle of the Nile. Its fate decided not by Egyptians, but by the competing European powers who viewed Kemetic heritage as a prize to be won. During the British colonial era, this plunder was formalized through organizations like the Egypt Exploration Fund, EEF, and the Egyptian Research Account, ERA, which were established for the explicit purpose of excavating and removing objects from Egypt. Wealthy donors in the West would fund these expeditions, and the artifacts collected would be dispersed to museums and private collections across the world. This process was codified through the partage system, implemented by the French head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, Gaston Maspero. This system, which divided archaeological finds between Egypt and the foreign excavating institutions, was an inherently colonial construct. It created a legal framework for theft designed and enforced by the colonizers to legitimize their claim over the heritage of the colonized. The result was the fragmentation of Egypt's history, with the contents of a single tomb often scattered across multiple museums in different countries, leaving modern Egypt reliant on Western documentation to piece together its own past. This appropriation extended beyond artifacts to the very landscape of Egypt itself. Colonial powers used urban planning and architecture as tools of domination and symbols of power. During Napoleon's campaign, a large avenue was cut through Cairo to facilitate the movement of French troops and intimidate the local population. This policy of demolishing indigenous towns and imposing European-style urban grids and neoclassical architecture was perfected during the later phases of colonialism by both the French and the British. Section 2. The Kemetic Renaissance, Reclaiming a Stolen History. In direct response to the colonial erasure and epistemic violence detailed in the preceding section, a powerful intellectual and political movement arose to reclaim Kemet as a Black African civilization. This movement, known as Afrocentrism, represents a profound act of decolonization, challenging the foundations of eurocentric historiography and seeking to restore a stolen legacy. Afrocentrism emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coinciding with the end of slavery and the decline of formal colonialism. It was conceived as a direct response to Eurocentrism, the worldview that favors European and Western civilization over all others, and to the colonial project of writing Africans out of history. The core tenet of the movement is to place African peoples at the center of their own historical narratives, asserting African agency, perspective, and self-determination in the study of culture, philosophy, and history, the foundational scholarship of Cheikh Anta Diop. No single figure is more central to the scholarly reclamation of Kemet than the Senegalese historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician Cheikh Anta Diop. His work provided the intellectual and scientific bedrock for the Afrocentric argument that ancient Egypt was a fundamentally black civilization and indeed the cradle of humanity. The institutional resistance to his decolonial project was immense. In 1951, he submitted his doctoral thesis to the Sorbonne in Paris based on the premise that pharaonic Egypt was an African civilization. It was rejected. Diop's arguments were multidisciplinary and rigorous, employing scientific modes of inquiry to provide what he termed irrefutable evidence in the face of racism. His most groundbreaking contribution was the development of a melanin dosage test. In 1974, he obtained pigment from Egyptian mummies and subjected it to microscopic analysis to determine its melanin content, thereby providing forensic-level scientific proof of their black identity. Beyond this, Diop marshaled evidence from anthropology, linguistics, and historical texts, arguing for a shared cultural and linguistic continuity that connected ancient Egypt to other African peoples across the continent, Molefi, Kete, Asante, and the theory of Afrocentricity. Building upon the foundation laid by Cheikh Anta Diop, the American scholar Molefi, Kete, Asante formalized the theory of Afrocentricity in the 1980s, providing a philosophical framework for the movement. His central concept is that of psychological location. He argues that for the past 500 years, people of African descent have been dislocated, violently removed, not only from their land, but from their philosophies, languages, religions, and myths. They have been placed on the margins of a European narrative, forced to view themselves as objects in someone else's history rather than subjects in their own. Afrocentricity, therefore, is the conscious act of recentering, of seeking what Asante calls the subject place of Africans in any social, political, or economic phenomenon. It is a disciplined perspective that enables scholars and students to study the world from an African standpoint. In seminal works like Afrocentricity, The Theory of Social Change, 1980, The Afrocentric Idea, 1987, and Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge, 1990, Asante explicitly links the reclamation of Kemetic history to this broader project of intellectual liberation. For Asante, Kemet represents the classical reference point for African civilization, a source of symbols, motifs, and philosophical concepts that can ground a modern African consciousness. Section 3, the District of Columbia, a colony at the heart of an empire. The historical precedent of colonial power dynamics established in Kemet provides a crucial framework for understanding the unique and contested political status of Washington, D.C. While not a colony in the traditional sense of overseas territory, the district's history of federal oversight, its demographic composition, and its residents' perpetual struggle for sovereignty reveal a quasi-colonial relationship at the very heart of the American empire, a history of contested autonomy. The foundation for federal supremacy over the District of Columbia was laid in the U.S. Constitution itself. The District Clause Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 grants Congress the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over the federal capital. A pivotal moment in this history came after the Civil War. The Organic Act of 1871 consolidated the various municipalities into a single territorial government with an appointed governor and a partially elected legislative assembly. This brief experiment in expanded self-governance was short-lived. In 1874, after an ambitious public works program led by Governor Alexander Roby Shepherd went significantly over budget, Congress abolished the territorial government entirely. Citing fiscal mismanagement, Congress instituted a system of direct rule by a 3-member board of commissioners appointed by the president. This form of government, with no elected local leadership, would continue for nearly a century. The long struggle for self-governance finally culminated in the passage of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act of 1973. This landmark legislation, ratified by D.C. voters, granted the city an elected mayor and a 13-member council. However, this autonomy was explicitly limited. The act preserved Congress's ultimate authority, establishing a mandatory review period during which Congress can modify or overturn any law passed by the D.C. Council. Furthermore, Congress retains control over the district's local budget, which is funded primarily by local taxes. The demographics of disenfranchisement, the struggle for sovereignty in Washington, D.C. is inextricably linked to its racial demographics. For much of the 20th century, D.C. was a majority black city, earning the moniker Chocolate City. The denial of self-governance during this period was therefore seen by many as the disenfranchisement of a predominantly black population by a predominantly white federal government. The modern push for home rule was deeply intertwined with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Black civil rights activists and organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as SNCC, framed the fight for D.C. autonomy as a fundamental civil rights issue. Section 4, the federal intervention, an anatomy of a modern takeover. The recent federal intervention in Washington, D.C. serves as a powerful contemporary case study, demonstrating how the historical mechanisms of external control are deployed in the 21st century. The anatomy of this takeover reveals a 3-part strategy. First, the construction of a crisis narrative to create a pretext for action. Second, the use of a unique legal mechanism to assert control. And third, the deployment of a militarized force to enforce that control, invoking emergency, the politics of a crisis narrative. The primary justification for the federal takeover was the administration's declaration of a crime emergency. The president painted a picture of a city under siege, describing conditions of complete and total lawlessness, and decrying the capital as being taken over by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals. This rhetorical strategy is a classic tool of political power. Leaders craft powerful narratives of crisis and decline to legitimize repressive policies, mobilize political support, and consolidate their own authority. By framing the situation as a dire emergency, the administration positioned itself as the sole entity capable of restoring order, a narrative that emotionally resonates with voters' fears and anxieties. However, this crisis narrative was starkly at odds with the available data. Statistics published by Washington's own Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, directly contradicted the president's claims. The data showed that overall violent crime in the city had dropped 26% compared to the previous year, with significant decreases in homicides, robberies, and armed carjackings since a post-pandemic peak in 2023. While the city did experience a high number of murders in 2023, it was not the highest rate ever. As the president claimed, homicide numbers in the 1990s were substantially higher. The discrepancy between the rhetoric of lawlessness and the reality of declining crime rates suggests that the crisis was not an objective fact, but a politically constructed frame. Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, the legal mechanism of control. The legal instrument used to execute this takeover was Section 740 of the 1973 Home Rule Act, a provision that had never before been invoked by a president. A meticulous analysis of this statute reveals that the administration's actions represented a significant and legally contested expansion of its narrow authority. Section 740 states that whenever the President of the United States determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist which require the use of the Metropolitan Police Force for federal purposes, he may direct the mayor to provide him such services. The language of the law imposes several critical limitations. Purpose: the request must be for federal purposes. Authority: the president may request that the mayor provide services. The statute does not grant the president the authority to seize operational command, remove the chief of police, or rescind departmental policies. Duration: the authority is strictly time limited.